High in the mist-covered mountains, where the borders of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand collide, a silent empire once rose from fields of fragile white flowers, reshaping global crime, international politics, and the lives of millions without most of the world ever seeing its true face. This region, known as the Golden Triangle, became synonymous with opium and heroin, but its story is not merely one of drugs. It is a story of geography, war, survival, ambition, and power forged in isolation. For decades, this remote corner of Southeast Asia supplied a staggering share of the world's heroin, fueling addiction crises thousands of miles away while enriching warlords and militias hidden deep within jungle strongholds. The mountains here are steep and unforgiving, the valleys narrow and cloaked in dense forest, and for much of the 20th century, the terrain itself acted as a natural shield against outside control. Roads were few, government authority was thin, and local communities often relied on subsistence farming to survive. In such an environment, the opium poppy, resilient and lucrative, became more than a crop. It became currency, leverage, and lifeline. The origins of opium cultivation in this region stretch back centuries, long before the modern drug trade took shape. Opium was historically used in traditional medicine and local trade networks across Asia, and small-scale cultivation existed in upland communities where other crops struggled to grow. But the transformation of the Golden Triangle into a global narcotics powerhouse did not happen overnight. It was shaped by colonial legacies, shifting political alliances, and the fallout of global conflicts that rippled through Southeast Asia. During the era of European colonial influence, opium was often regulated, taxed, and in some cases encouraged as a revenue source. The structures created during that period introduced systems of distribution and trade that would later be exploited by criminal networks. Yet the true expansion of the Golden Triangle's opium economy accelerated in the aftermath of World War II, when regional instability and armed struggle created fertile ground for illicit enterprise. As colonial powers withdrew and new nations struggled to consolidate authority, large swaths of borderland territory remained contested and loosely governed. In Myanmar, then known as Burma, ethnic armed groups fought the central government for autonomy and control. These conflicts were not brief skirmishes, but prolonged insurgencies that fractured the country's frontier regions. In Laos and parts of northern Thailand, similar patterns of weak central oversight and mountainous terrain limited effective enforcement. Armed factions needed resources to sustain their campaigns, purchase weapons, and maintain loyalty among fighters. Opium offered a solution that was both practical and profitable. The crop thrived in high-altitude climates, required relatively little infrastructure, and commanded high prices in international markets. For many rural farmers, cultivating poppy was not an ideological choice, but an economic necessity. With limited access to markets, healthcare, and alternative livelihoods, opium became one of the few reliable sources of cash income. Middlemen and militia leaders organized collection, protection, and transport, gradually building networks that connected isolated villages to broader trafficking routes. As production increased, so did the sophistication of the trade. Raw opium was processed into morphine base and eventually refined into heroin, a product that was easier to transport and far more profitable. Laboratories hidden in jungle clearings or remote mountain compounds became part of an expanding supply chain. Caravans of pack animals carried loads across treacherous trails, while bribery and corruption opened pathways through checkpoints and border crossings. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Golden Triangle had emerged as one of the world's primary sources of illicit opiates. Global demand, particularly in Western markets, surged during this period, creating powerful incentives for expansion. The Vietnam War further complicated the landscape as regional militarization intensified and weapons flowed across borders. Some armed groups reportedly leveraged their anti-communist positioning to secure tacit tolerance or indirect support, allowing their drug operations to flourish under the shadow of broader geopolitical struggles. In this environment, certain figures rose to prominence, blending roles as military commanders, political actors, and drug traffickers, They controlled territory, commanded private armies, and negotiated alliances that shifted with changing circumstances. These individuals were often portrayed in starkly different ways depending on perspective, as defenders of ethnic identity, ruthless criminals, or pragmatic power brokers navigating a chaotic frontier. What united them was their reliance on the opium economy as a central pillar of authority. The profits generated by heroin shipments financed weapons purchases, paid soldiers, and reinforced patronage networks that bound communities to their leadership. Meanwhile, the remoteness of the Golden Triangle continued to frustrate enforcement efforts. Dense forests, concealed cultivation sites, and limited infrastructure hindered surveillance. International cooperation was often uneven, shaped by competing strategic priorities. Attempts at eradication sometimes pushed farmers deeper into marginal areas rather than eliminating production altogether. Over time, trafficking routes evolved, stretching from Southeast Asia into Hong Kong, Taiwan, Europe, and North America. Maritime channels, overland corridors, and clandestine air transport all played roles in moving product from remote mountains to distant cities. The Golden Triangle became a symbol of a hidden system where local hardship intersected with global demand. Yet the region's story is not only about the peak years of heroin dominance, it is also about adaptation. As pressure mounted and enforcement strategies intensified in later decades, production patterns began to shift. Alternative development programs sought to encourage farmers to cultivate other crops, offering incentives and infrastructure support. Some areas saw declines in poppy fields, while others adapted through diversification into synthetic drugs. Even so, the legacy of the Golden Triangle's opium era remains embedded in regional power structures and trafficking knowledge. Networks built during the height of heroin production did not simply disappear. They evolved, maintaining connections that continue to influence contemporary illicit markets. The geography that once protected caravans of opium still shapes modern smuggling routes. The relationships forged between armed groups, brokers, and international buyers laid foundations for organized crime structures that outlived individual leaders. Understanding how the Golden Triangle became such a formidable narcotics hub requires examining the convergence of factors that extended far beyond simple criminal intent. It was the combination of difficult terrain, chronic instability, economic marginalization, and global appetite for opiates that allowed this hidden empire to rise. Farmers growing poppies on steep hillsides were linked, often unknowingly, to consumers in cities half a world away. Warlords negotiating ceasefires or territorial control were also negotiating supply chains and distribution agreements. Governments attempting to assert sovereignty over remote borderlands faced not only insurgency, but an entrenched underground economy capable of financing resistance. The Golden Triangle thus represents a complex intersection of local realities and international consequences. Its history challenges simplistic narratives by revealing how illicit economies can become deeply embedded in political and social structures. The white poppy fields that once blanketed mountain slopes were more than agricultural plots. They were nodes in a vast network that connected remote villages to global markets. As we trace the origins and rise of this secret empire, we begin to see how a convergence of geography and conflict transformed a remote region into a central artery of the world's heroin trade, setting the stage for powerful drug lords, enduring trafficking routes, and a legacy that continues to shape the international narcotics landscape today. As the Golden Triangle's opium economy expanded through the latter half of the 20th century, its hidden architecture became increasingly complex, transforming from scattered poppy fields into a coordinated system that rivaled legitimate global industries in organization and scale. The mountains where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand converge were no longer simply remote highlands. They had become strategic assets in a vast illicit enterprise. Armed factions entrenched themselves deeper into the terrain, carving out zones of influence where they controlled taxation, security, and cultivation. In many of these territories, state authority was nominal or entirely absent, replaced by parallel administrations funded largely by narcotics revenue. Militias built fortified bases, developed communication networks, and forged alliances that allowed them to move product across borders with calculated precision. The drug trade did not operate in isolation from political realities. Rather, it intertwined with them. Ethnic insurgencies in Myanmar's Shan state, for example, navigated a complex battlefield in which survival depended not only on military strength but on financial resilience. Opium profits became the backbone of resistance for some groups, enabling them to purchase modern weapons and sustain long campaigns against central authorities. The geography of Shan State, with its rugged hills and labyrinthine valleys, provided natural corridors for cultivation and concealment. Across the border in Laos, similar highland communities participated in poppy farming, often under the influence of local power brokers who negotiated with larger trafficking networks. Northern Thailand, though more stable in comparison, still faced challenges in policing its mountainous frontier, where cross-border trade blurred the line between legal commerce and contraband. Over time, certain figures rose to prominence as dominant forces within this shadow economy, combining military authority with entrepreneurial calculation. These leaders oversaw not just cultivation, but processing, protection, and export. Laboratories refined morphine base into high-purity heroin, often referred to as number 4 heroin, which commanded premium prices in international markets. The production process required chemical precursors, equipment, and skilled technicians, demonstrating that the Golden Triangle's operations were far from primitive. Supply chains extended outward through intermediaries who arranged maritime shipments and coordinated distribution networks in urban centers across Asia and beyond. Hong Kong emerged as a critical transit point during peak years, serving as a gateway to global markets due to its port infrastructure and financial networks. From there, heroin found its way to Europe, Australia, and North America, feeding demand that was escalating in the 1960s and 1970s. The Vietnam War further intensified regional instability, and although the conflict's primary theater lay elsewhere, its ripple effects were felt throughout Southeast Asia. Military movements, refugee flows, and the proliferation of arms altered the balance of power in border regions. In this volatile environment, narcotics revenue often became intertwined with broader geopolitical strategies. Allegations and controversies arose regarding the extent to which anti-communist militias tolerated or engaged in drug trafficking to sustain their operations. While the full complexity of these relationships remains debated, what is clear is that the opium economy flourished amid the chaos of shifting alliances and proxy struggles. The Golden Triangle's isolation allowed its leaders to negotiate from a position of relative autonomy, balancing local grievances with global opportunity. By the 1980s, international attention increasingly focused on the region as heroin from Southeast Asia was linked to addiction crises abroad. Governments invested in eradication campaigns, aerial surveillance, and cross-border cooperation. Thailand, in particular, implemented aggressive crop substitution programs, promoting alternative livelihoods such as coffee, tea, and horticulture in highland areas. These initiatives, combined with stronger enforcement and infrastructure development, gradually reduced large-scale poppy cultivation within Thai territory. Myanmar and Laos, however, faced deeper structural challenges, including ongoing insurgencies and limited administrative capacity. In Myanmar's borderlands, ceasefire agreements sometimes allowed armed groups to retain territorial control in exchange for nominal peace, creating ambiguous zones where narcotics production could continue with limited interference. During this period, the structure of trafficking networks evolved further. Organized crime groups outside Southeast Asia formed partnerships with Golden Triangle suppliers, establishing distribution channels that were both diversified and resilient. The profitability of heroin encouraged reinvestment into other illicit ventures, including arms trafficking, money laundering, and later, synthetic drug production. Financial flows moved through informal banking systems and offshore accounts, complicating efforts to trace and disrupt them. The Golden Triangle became emblematic of how geography and governance gaps could enable transnational criminal enterprises to entrench themselves across continents. At the local level, the opium economy left a mixed legacy. For many rural families, poppy cultivation had provided income in regions where roads, schools, and healthcare facilities were scarce. Yet dependency on a single illicit crop also exposed communities to volatility, violence, and cycles of debt. Farmers often borrowed money in advance of harvests, tying them to brokers who dictated prices. When eradication campaigns destroyed crops without providing viable alternatives, hardship deepened. This tension highlighted the complexity of addressing narcotics production solely through force. Sustainable change required economic transformation, infrastructure investment, and trust building between governments and marginalized populations. Meanwhile, certain warlords sought to legitimize or reshape their public image, presenting themselves as political actors rather than mere traffickers. They engaged in negotiations, participated in ceasefire talks, and in some cases attempted to rebrand their territories as autonomous regions seeking development. Yet the wealth accumulated during peak trafficking years had already altered the power dynamics of the region. Lavish compounds, private militias, and patronage systems reinforced hierarchies that were difficult to dismantle. Even as heroin production from the Golden Triangle declined relative to other regions such as Afghanistan's Golden Crescent, the infrastructure built during its apex remained influential. Roads carved into mountains for smuggling could be repurposed for other trade. Networks of trust among brokers and transporters adapted to new commodities. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, synthetic drugs, particularly methamphetamine, began to dominate parts of the regional narcotics market. The same borderlands that once hosted opium caravans now facilitated the movement of precursor chemicals and synthetic tablets. This shift demonstrated the adaptability of criminal enterprises rooted in the Golden Triangle's history. They were not static organizations tied exclusively to one crop, but flexible networks responsive to demand and enforcement pressure. International cooperation improved over time, with regional organizations promoting intelligence sharing and joint operations. Yet the terrain remained a formidable challenge. Mountain passes, porous borders, and dense forests continued to offer concealment. Corruption within local institutions sometimes undermined enforcement efforts, allowing trafficking to persist despite official crackdowns. The story of the Golden Triangle during this era illustrates how illicit economies can evolve in response to policy interventions. When heroin routes faced disruption, traffickers diversified pathways and products. When eradication campaigns intensified, cultivation shifted geographically or went deeper underground. The resilience of these networks was rooted in decades of accumulated experience, capital, and cross-border relationships. At the global level, the Golden Triangle's heroin-shaped patterns of addiction, law enforcement strategy, and international diplomacy. Urban centers grappling with rising heroin use confronted the reality that supply chains extended far beyond their jurisdiction. This recognition spurred new forms of cooperation, including extradition agreements, financial monitoring, and coordinated interdiction. Yet the demand side of the equation remained powerful. As long as consumers were willing to pay high prices, producers and traffickers retained incentives to adapt. Within Southeast Asia, gradual economic growth and infrastructure development altered some of the conditions that had once favored large-scale poppy cultivation. Expanded road networks brought markets and services closer to remote communities, while education initiatives offered alternative aspirations for younger generations. Nevertheless, pockets of instability and poverty persisted, sustaining environments where illicit activities could take root. The Golden Triangle's legacy thus cannot be understood solely through statistics of production or seizure. It is embedded in the lived experiences of borderland communities, the institutional evolution of regional governments, and the enduring architecture of transnational crime. The era of towering heroin dominance may have waned, but the influence of those decades continues to echo through contemporary trafficking patterns. By tracing the consolidation of power among drug lords, the integration of local cultivation into global supply chains, and the adaptive strategies that followed enforcement pressure, we gain a deeper understanding of how a remote mountain region became a central node in the world's narcotics economy. The Golden Triangle stands as a case study in how geography, conflict, and economic disparity can converge to produce consequences that ripple across continents, shaping policies, fueling violence, and leaving behind networks that outlast the fields of white poppies from which they first emerged. As we trace the origins and rise of this secret empire, we begin to see how a convergence of geography and conflict transformed a remote region into a central artery of the world's heroin trade, setting the stage for powerful drug lords, enduring trafficking routes, and a legacy that continues to shape the international narcotics landscape today. Even as the era of massive heroin dominance in the Golden Triangle began to decline in relative global comparison, the shadow of its past continued to stretch far beyond the mountain ridges where it first took root, influencing modern trafficking routes, regional power dynamics, and the evolving architecture of transnational organized crime. The world often assumes that illicit empires collapse when their primary commodity fades, yet the Golden Triangle demonstrates something far more enduring. Networks built on geography, trust, secrecy, and adaptability rarely disappear. They transform. By the early 21st century, global heroin production patterns had shifted significantly, with Afghanistan's Golden Crescent rising to prominence. International focus pivoted accordingly, and the Golden Triangle no longer dominated headlines in the same way it once had. However, beneath this apparent decline, long-established trafficking corridors, financial systems, and cross-border relationships remained intact, quietly adapting to new forms of demand. In many ways, the infrastructure created during decades of opium and heroin trade laid the groundwork for the region's transition into a major hub for synthetic narcotics, particularly methamphetamine, which could be manufactured year-round without reliance on seasonal harvests. The mountainous terrain that once concealed poppy fields now sheltered laboratories producing crystalline stimulants in volumes that rivaled the heroin shipments of previous generations. Armed groups and criminal syndicates leveraged their historical experience in evasion, logistics, and bribery to protect these operations. Borderlands, where sovereignty had always been contested, continued to serve as buffers against centralized enforcement, and the legacy of fragile governance provided space for illicit economies to endure. What changed was not the existence of organized crime, but its product portfolio and distribution strategy. Synthetic drugs offered distinct advantages over opium cultivation. They required chemical precursors rather than farmland, enabling production to be concentrated in hidden facilities that could relocate when threatened. Profits could be reinvested rapidly, and the final product was compact, potent, and easy to transport. The Golden Triangle's established smuggling routes into Thailand, Laos, China, and onward to international markets became conduits for these new commodities. Meanwhile, regional demand for methamphetamine surged, particularly in urban centers, experiencing rapid economic transformation. This internal market reduced dependence on distant buyers and further entrenched production networks within Southeast Asia itself. Yet even as synthetic drugs rose, opium did not vanish entirely. In certain remote areas, poppy cultivation persisted as a coping mechanism for communities lacking viable alternatives. Although overall cultivation levels fluctuated, the historical knowledge of farming, harvesting, and processing remained embedded in local memory. International agencies continued to support crop substitution programs, infrastructure development, and community-based initiatives aimed at reducing reliance on illicit crops. Some projects succeeded in improving livelihoods, while others struggled against entrenched poverty, limited market access, and the volatility of agricultural prices. The challenge of replacing a high-value illicit commodity with legal crops that yield lower profit margins proved complex and uneven. Furthermore, political instability in parts of Myanmar in the 2010s and beyond reintroduced uncertainty into border regions. Renewed conflict disrupted governance structures and created new zones of limited oversight, echoing conditions that had originally allowed the opium economy to flourish decades earlier. When conflict intensifies, illicit trade often finds opportunity, and the Golden Triangle's historical networks were well positioned to exploit shifting power balances. Armed actors could tax movement through territories they controlled, and criminal syndicates could negotiate protection in exchange for financial incentives. The lessons learned during the peak heroin years, including how to conceal production sites, manage cross-border transportation, and launder profits through complex channels, remained relevant. Financial flows became increasingly sophisticated, utilizing digital transfers, shell companies, and informal remittance systems that blurred the boundary between legal and illegal economies. As globalization accelerated, so too did the ability of trafficking organizations to integrate into legitimate trade networks, concealing contraband within the vast volume of goods moving across Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle's story also reverberates in international policy debates about supply versus demand. Decades of eradication efforts demonstrated that destroying crops without addressing underlying economic drivers could produce temporary declines, but rarely permanent solutions. When farmers lost poppy fields, some migrated, others shifted to different illicit activities, and a few entered legal agriculture only if sustainable support existed. The resilience of trafficking networks suggested that as long as global demand for narcotics remained high, supply would adapt geographically. Thus, the Golden Triangle became a case study for policymakers seeking to balance enforcement with development, recognizing that durable change required investment in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and governance. On the global stage, the heroin that once flowed from these mountains influenced criminal networks far beyond Southeast Asia. Distribution partnerships forged during the 20th century connected Golden Triangle suppliers with syndicates in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Australia, and Western countries. Although the primary source of heroin for many markets later shifted, the relationships and channels established during those years helped shape broader patterns of organized crime cooperation. Some of these networks diversified into other illicit sectors, including human trafficking, wildlife smuggling, and cyber-enabled financial fraud. In this way, the Golden Triangle's legacy extends into domains that have little direct connection to opium itself, but share the same structural foundations of secrecy, trust-based alliances, and transnational coordination. The image of caravans crossing misty mountain passes may belong to an earlier era, yet the underlying principle remains unchanged. Remote geography combined with weak oversight can incubate systems that reach far beyond their point of origin. Modern surveillance technologies, satellite imagery, and regional task forces have undoubtedly increased the pressure on trafficking organizations. Joint operations between neighboring countries have disrupted laboratories and seized large quantities of drugs. However, enforcement remains a constant contest of adaptation. When authorities close one route, traffickers explore another. When precursors are restricted in one jurisdiction, they seek alternative suppliers elsewhere. The Golden Triangle's decades-long history provided a training ground in resilience, teaching criminal actors how to navigate crackdowns without collapsing entirely. At the same time, there are signs of gradual transformation within parts of the region. Expanded infrastructure projects have connected previously isolated communities to national economies. Tourism in northern Thailand and parts of Laos has offered alternative income streams, and some former opium-growing villages now cultivate specialty crops or participate in ecotourism initiatives. Education access has improved in certain districts, broadening opportunities for younger generations. Yet disparities remain stark in more conflict-affected zones, where instability undermines consistent development. The tension between progress and persistence defines the Golden Triangle's modern reality. It is neither the unchallenged heroin empire of the past, nor a region fully free from the influence of narcotics networks. Instead, it occupies a complex middle ground shaped by history, adaptation, and ongoing struggle. Understanding this evolution is essential for grasping how illicit economies endure. The Golden Triangle teaches that criminal enterprises are rarely static. They mirror the economic and political environments around them. When global heroin demand surged in the 20th century, the region supplied it. When synthetic stimulants became more profitable and easier to produce, operations pivoted. When enforcement intensified in one country, production shifted across a porous border. Each phase reflected a dynamic interplay between local conditions and international markets. The human dimension of this story cannot be ignored. Behind every statistic of tons seized or hectares eradicated are communities negotiating survival in difficult circumstances. Some individuals were drawn into trafficking by opportunity and ambition, others by necessity and lack of options. The profits accumulated by powerful drug lords often contrasted sharply with the modest earnings of farmers cultivating poppies on steep slopes. Meanwhile, consumers in distant cities bore the health and social consequences of addiction, rarely aware of the complex web connecting them to remote mountain villages. The Golden Triangle's history reveals how interconnected the world has long been, even before the digital age made such connections more visible. The opium fields of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand were never isolated from global currents. They were deeply embedded within them. Today, as international strategies evolve and regional cooperation deepens, the legacy of the Golden Triangle remains a reminder that geography alone does not determine destiny, but it can profoundly shape opportunity. The same mountains that sheltered illicit empires also hold potential for sustainable development if stability and investment take root. Whether the region's future tilts more toward integration and prosperity or remains entangled with underground economies depends on a complex array of political, economic, and social forces. What is certain is that the Golden Triangle's secret empire left an indelible mark on the global narcotics landscape. Its rise demonstrated how remote borderlands could become central nodes in international trade when demand and instability align. Its transformation illustrates how criminal networks adapt rather than vanish, and its enduring influence underscores the importance of addressing both the supply and demand dimensions of illicit markets. The story of the Golden Triangle is ultimately a story about systems, how they emerge, how they entrench themselves, and how they evolve under pressure. It is a reminder that behind the headlines of seizures and crackdowns lies a deeper narrative about governance, opportunity, and resilience. The mountains still stand, the borders still intersect, and the networks forged over decades continue to cast long shadows. If you are benefiting from our topics, please subscribe, like, and turn on the bell notification so you can see our new videos early.